Hello, everyone. I'm Martin Andrews, Communications Director at inquirED, and welcome to today's webinar, Layers of Meaning, Knowledge Building, and Complex Texts. This webinar is the second in our spring series, Building Background Knowledge, Literacy, Democracy, and Community. Next up in the series, we'll be joined by Melissa Marks to explore how to use diverse books and inquiry to teach history. And finally, we'll talk with award-winning author Dave Eggers and illustrator Sean Harris about their book, What Can a Citizen Do? You can find out more at inquirED.org/webinars. This series is brought to you by the National Council for the Social Studies and inquirED. Founded in 1921, the National Council for the Social Studies is the largest professional organization in the country devoted solely to social studies education. You should go over to socialstudies.org/professional-learning to find out about all the professional learning options they have. The series is also brought to you by inquirED. inquirED has created Inquiry Journeys, our elementary social studies curriculum, to move students and teachers beyond the textbook, supporting culturally responsive education, inquiry-based teaching and learning, and now you can actually sign up for a free trial at inquirED.org/free trial. We want to dig right into our subject matter today, and before we bring on our panelists, I'm going to give a little bit of background. We're going to look at what we mean when we say a complex text. One common misconception is that what makes a text complex is just the vocabulary. And in reality, vocabulary is only one of the factors that affects text complexity. Now, I know that a lot of you are familiar with giving your students a poem for the first time, and that poem might have really simple vocabulary, but it's in a format that they're unfamiliar with, and that format itself can make that text complex. To do a complexity checkup, inquirED asks a number of questions. First, are the students unfamiliar with the topic and vocabulary? So vocabulary is important, but the topic can also affect whether or not a text is complex. Are the words or ideas abstract? Does the text use formal language, styles, or conventions? Or is the text structured, like those poems, in an unfamiliar way? Now, I want to do a quick check-in with a unit we're going to look at later on, and that is the 4th grade Natural Resources of the U.S. unit. And our teacher, panelist Paul Hahn, teaches this unit with his students. And what might make this unit complex is that it's one of the first times that students might encounter really abstract vocabulary terms like scarcity, or renewable and non-renewable resources, or sustainability. So just the topic and the new vocabulary can make the whole unit more complex for students to understand. And we're going to dig into that unit just a little bit later on. So now the question is, if texts are complex, why do we dig into them in the first place? What are the benefits of digging into complex texts with students? Well, first of all, it's about practice, and some more practice, because students are going to interact with complex texts throughout their life, because they're going to need to accomplish a task in the future, or perhaps it's part of their career choice, but it's going to be something that they have to interact with. So they're really practicing the thinking moves and strategies to read complex texts in the world. Also, they're building those transferable skills like questioning and context building that they're going to need to tackle those texts. Also, complex texts give access to deep background knowledge. And we know from our previous webinar that background knowledge is really important when you're dealing with literacy, when you're trying to improve reading comprehension outcomes. If you limit the kinds of texts students come in contact with, you're also limiting that deep background knowledge that they can build. Finally, research suggests that students actually learn more with more difficult texts if they have instructional support. For example, a 2017 study found 3rd graders who started as weak readers outscored even proficient readers when they used texts written 2 grade levels above their initial reading level as part of a paired reading exercises. And we'll share that study in our blog that should come out next week. So there are multiple reasons why students should interact with complex texts. One of the reasons that we all connect with on this webinar who are social studies educators is that really complex texts are essential for social studies. First, I think there's a good reason to sort of pick apart the different ways that we think about texts and sources in ELA and social studies. In ELA, a text can be just about anything. It can be a poem, but it also can be an image. It can be a podcast. That is the meaning of text in ELA. In social studies, we would call all of those things sources. And then amongst the list of sources, you might encounter a text. So there's a little difference in how we talk about them, and that's important sort of to bring out. Now, in social studies, you can't escape complex texts because many historical sources are by necessity complex. You can't get past the Declaration of Independence, and no matter what grade level you read the Declaration or the Constitution, it's a complex text that you really need to dig into. The structure is different, the vocabulary, the concepts, the ideas, the style, all of those make it a complex text. So we need complex texts in the social studies because they're part of the historical record. But we also need them to practice the disciplinary skills of the social scientists. So social scientists compare and contrast events, accounts, documents. They interpret primary and secondary sources. They use the knowledge of the present to interpret the past. They build context and meaning. They untangle threads of fact from conflicting accounts. All of those require the use of complex texts. But it's not only that. In the social studies, also, we deal with complex subjects. And I want to show you an example of a fourth grade reading passage about Columbus and his first interactions with the people in the New World, so called, to Columbus. And I want to show you that same passage leveled for second graders. Take a look at this first passage for fourth graders. And now take a look at the passage for second graders. And I'm going to leave those up there for a second for you to look at. Now, think about the differences in these two passages. What has been lost? And many people in the chat during our webinar, they're saying that, well, everything has been lost. That the second grade passage has really lost its value as a source of information because the text complexity has been leveled out, and so the subject matter complexity has been leveled out. And it is creating a misconception about this historical event that might have to be cleared up later on in historical studies. So here's an example of a text where it's important, if you are going to address this subject, that you don't level out the complexity. Okay, I want to dig in now how we can scaffold for complex texts. The first thing that we need to do is establish what complex texts are we looking at. And because we're focusing on that fourth grade natural resources unit, we pulled a complex text out of that unit and we want to take a look at it. And it is a informational article about renewable and non-renewable resources. Now, looking at this article, what might make it complex? Well, brand new vocabulary, renewable, non-renewable. Maybe the format is new for new fourth graders. It's an informational text. Maybe they haven't seen it before. It has captions next to pictures. And some of the ideas in there are also abstract. So all of those qualities could make this text difficult for students or complex. What we want to look at is, how do we get students ready to read this text? How do they prepare for reading? How do they process during reading? And how do they reflect after reading? And actually, the process of preparing for this text starts way before the students ever encounter the text, because in inquiry, it's really about playing the long game of comprehension, understanding, and knowledge building. So this text comes about halfway through the unit on natural resources. And what have they experienced before this time? Well, at the very beginning of the unit, they were introduced to the subject through a simulation or game. They have to preserve the resources that they have. These resources are imaginary. They're called well snips. And they have to make sure they don't run out. They have to feed their community, provide for their community, and leave enough to reproduce for the next year. So they're learning in this very first activity about the idea of sustainability. And it's allowing them to do it in a way that is low stakes and highly engaging. Now, they also next go on a region investigation to look at how different regions of the United States use natural resources, what resources are there. And so by the time they come to this lesson where they encounter this complex text, they've built up a deep background knowledge. And then what happens during the lesson to get them ready for this complex text? That's the question that we're going to have Jillian Corr talk about, and then we're going to move into a conversation with our other panelists. And here are our panelists for our webinar today. We have Jane Patrick, a learning experience designer at inquirED, Jillian Corr, a learning experience architect at inquirED, and Paul Hahn, a teacher, 4th grade at Next Generation Schools. And Jillian, I wondered if you could talk through like the benefit of, maybe describe what this activity is and the benefit of this activity as a setup to that complex text.
I think there are a couple of roles for an activity like this. So students may leave this, in this case, the sustainability simulation, thinking you can harvest as many of these well snippers as you want, but you have to stay within a rate of renewal. So they've sort of experienced this. So kind of a quick response is sort of a moralistic response of like, well, we just shouldn't harvest them. And so it's really important, I think, to add nuance to this idea of sustainability by drawing this direct connection to natural resources in students' lives. And so I'm going to come back to what Paul said, like they think they know. And there's a simple matching game where they just start to look at all the ways that natural resources are a part of their daily life. This is one of several activities that are about like even looking at a pencil and like, the amount that we use in a year and all of the natural resources connected to that. And then doing this simple game allows students to use words that are going to come up in the text around specific resources, and also to do some matching. I had the opportunity to watch some students do this, and it was like there was a lot of dialogue around what was the raw material or what was the natural resource that we used for the things in our lives. And so it's the kind of like just a low stakes way to get the words peppering, also introduce some associated words like timber or lumber or words that they might not hear in the context of the game. And then I have a discussion about it. And in discussion, you're kind of reinforcing some of these words. So you've sort of built this familiarity. And I think you've built that sort of personal investment or connection to the content. And you've, I think, simultaneously made the question of sustainability just a little more nuanced. We need water, we need to eat. We also, introduce things like soil that they might not think about in the span of natural resources. But when you're about to talk about the Dust Bowl, it's a nice breadcrumb for them understanding depletion of resources. So there's a lot going on in a really simple game.
So we're in the mode of preparing for reading. The long game has prepared them. In the lesson, we've tried to activate some of their prior knowledge. And now this is before the reading happens, really focusing the investigation. And Jillian, if you can talk a little bit about what it does to focus students in, and then maybe a little bit about how this could also be about some thinking around sourcing in the social studies. What's the benefit of this focus on and preview the text? I think a lot of our teachers probably do this, but what's the benefit of it?
So I think, previewing a text is something that happens in ELA classrooms as well. Just, what are the text features? What do we know about this topic? Just kind of like activating that prior knowledge, that schema, getting some words peppering, percolating. Where I think we continue on a little bit is in social studies, asking those questions about who wrote this, what might their perspective be, like, is this a trusted source? We want that to be muscle memory with students. So we always take that pause to lean in on the text and understand as much as we can about the source before we dig in. And then in terms of that, like kind of focus, persistence, motivation, really being clear about why we're reading it and what we're going to scoop in for. Like when I go to Apple support, I know exactly what I need to find. I don't need to understand every word. I need to know why I'm reading that text. So we really do often look at informational texts as sources of evidence that we need to marshal toward a question. And we try to really make that explicit, the purpose of why this text in this moment, and how will we know on the back end that we found the information that we needed.
It's interesting. I feel like there's an issue of like, I want to make a student feel safe with this text. I mean, safe is a strange word to use, but like, I know it. I've seen it. It's got a shape. We've previewed it. I have this so that it isn't so intimidating when I first encounter it. And then I know why I'm digging into it. I'm digging into it to answer this question. I'm digging into it to gather this evidence. So I feel familiar with it and I know why I'm doing it. That makes my blood pressure reduce when I think about it. Jillian, can you talk me through a little bit of this? So we've got preparing for reading, and now I'm reading. And what are some of the strategies that for this text specifically that are being used to help students process this complex text?
Yeah, I would make a plug for varying your reading strategies. I think making meaning together can still be a great way to engage with a complex text. Really hearing your own thinking and reasoning aloud, with a partner is an incredibly powerful way to develop comprehension of something that you're reading. I think the other thing is, creating these records of evidence, we call them, is just like when you are kind of recording your ideas and really trying to pull evidence, you can then have it see the light of day. And again, you can see where you are relative to the goal or purpose. Monitoring your own comprehension is just, we call that really, corroborating findings. There's a lot of like, how is this tracking with prior knowledge that I brought in? Is it extending it? Is it challenging it? And then, at the end, it's really about mining the text for whatever that juicy question is that we're asking kids to grapple with.
Paul, I want to bring you in here because one of the things that I heard you talk about was take this text, break up into smaller groups. So you're using a lot of those processes in your strategies in your classroom, and these two materials that you sent along of annotating and evidence gathering. Can you talk a little bit about how, I'm sure you have a range of readers in your classroom, and can you talk both about how these strategies help across that range? And how that partner work, how those multiple at bats with a read aloud and a partner reading also support that.
Yeah, I definitely have a range. I have some students who can read this, no problem, and actually draw out many of the ideas. But the challenge there sometimes is they might not actually know what they're talking about. They actually sound like they do. And then I have students who are on the opposite end of the spectrum who are not going to want to read this out loud in front of a class or in front of a partner because they're struggling and the words are very unfamiliar and they may not be reading at grade level. And so the discussion comes after a whole group where we might actually read this together or we might chunk it. And as we do that, they hear it first. So that's the auditory component. And then there is the verbal aspect where then when they talk about it, and then I will give them one goal only, and saying, this is the part we're going to focus on first. And so it might be circling unfamiliar words. It might be underlining what we feel like is a main idea. And that will also be tied together at times with what we're doing in English language arts. And so there's a familiarity of, hey, I do this in reading time. I do this in writing. I do this in social studies. And so there's a constant exposure of that skill. And then along with that, even with the article findings, I definitely don't ask students to just fill it out. We focus on parts of it and sections, and I break up my time that way. So I know that I'm keeping time with where I want to be in the lesson, but also having the students realize they can do just this part. And then we might visit it quickly, and then we're doing just this next section now. And so that way it really does feel like you can be capable of not only finishing, but you leave with some understanding at the same time. And so this is just, again, artifacts from some of my own students who have done that. We really, at least at my level, in the primary school levels, there's a lot more emphasis on fiction. And so we're trying to be a lot more intentional also about nonfiction texts. And not just saying, okay, by the way, here's a nonfiction thing we must do because you're supposed to learn, but showing them how integral nonfiction is both for not only learning, but enjoyment. And then there's skills we learn along the way. And there's also a variety of nonfiction. And so as we're actually doing this across in our planning, we're realizing, hey, when we align our curriculum here, we can actually not treat social studies as a separate entity. This actually goes together. And when they partner, we realize we can actually do the nonfiction unit here and in social studies too. And then we could do the social studies here as well as in the reading as well. And so we're going across subject areas. And that way students also, I think, make a clear connection as well. So instead of saying this is social studies time, this is English language arts time, they realize, oh, what I'm actually focusing on is it's a skill. We're going to find unfamiliar words. We're going to find examples. We're going to give what we like to call evidence. What's your evidence? Where did you find it in the text? Or a very simple way, sometimes I say to my students, I say, prove it. Show me your proof. And so I think that way is just a really, integral way of just making sure that it's a partnership versus a separation between subject areas.
I like that, a partnership instead of a separation. I want to jump to talking a little bit about what happens in the social studies. Often we're not looking at just one source. So processing while reading is you've got a complex text, you're reading it, and you're also looking to corroborate that text with another source. I don't know, Jane, if that's something different about the social studies, that it seems like we're always finding a way to use one source to support another. We're always looking for evidence. Talk to me, Jane, a little bit about that when you're approaching a complex text, that it's just one part of what you're doing as a social scientist.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it really goes back to where we started, right? And why we're engaging with these complex texts in social studies to begin with. I think it's such a key disciplinary skill to, hear and take in multiple perspectives and consider, varying points of view as we try to uncover, the truth about history. And if we ever can fully uncover it. And so, corroborating those findings through multiple texts, some of which may be more complex than others, just feels really, really key to the study of social studies.
And I know for you, Jane, like it's your, Jillian said, Jane really is always talking about how we need to take a pause and make sure that students have that space to reflect on their interaction with a complex text. Tell me a little bit about the reflecting on reading, what it allows students to do, and different strategies maybe we can use to reflect on a complex text.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can't overstate the importance of just think time and letting students sit with a text and make meaning of it and bring those skills that we've been developing to bear as they try to access it, or even just highlight those pieces of the text that are still opaque, that they still can't kind of sense make of. So maybe students are summarizing what they have comprehended, and then they're posing more questions that are going to drive that inquiry that we're in, or, maybe they're synthesizing information from that great rich corroboration that we do in social studies to make meaning, and giving students the time to do that, either through discussion, or I think my former ELA background comes out. I really love for students to have opportunities to do that in writing. However broadly we define writing, I think we can define drawing as writing as well in those sense-making opportunities. But I feel so valuable and so important to give students that time to really grapple with the text as they are trying to kind of position it in their study of history.
Yeah. So Paul, I wonder if you could talk a little bit. You talked about a little bit about this earlier. Where are they headed next in the inquiry? And ultimately, where are they going?
Yeah, the next is what are we going to do about what we have learned,
Yeah.
or informed action? And I think that makes actually a big difference versus feeling like, oh, I'm just doing this because my teacher said I had to. We're actually going to do something with this. And so that planning part where we're actually now going to be going through, okay, here's what we've learned, the informed action steps. So even that is not just a big question we give, but it's done step by step process of designing and actually getting student feedback and investment in that process versus the teacher just saying, you're going to do this. And so that has actually created, I think, more authentically at the very end of our inquiry process, a product that is very meaningful. It has a personal touch. It's very invested in, and it's going to be shared outside of our classroom where we actually have decided to do something within our school, and so that the impact can start at a very local level.
And I have the sample that you brought. Could you talk us through a little bit? What did they decide to do? Who did they try to impact? Can you tell us a little bit about where they went?
Absolutely. We decided to create as a class an A to Z book, a sustainability A to Z book. And we wanted to make sure we shared this with a target audience. And we felt that that target audience was actually going to be our kindergartners in our school. And so talking about complex text, how in the world do you teach this now to kindergartners? And so we had decided that each of the letters of our alphabet will be covering some sort of topic related to what we've learned. We've assigned different portions of the book to students throughout our whole class. That cover was created by one of our students who loves to draw, which is also, like Jane was saying, I believe also a form of writing. And we had somebody focus on the table of contents. And then we also had somebody create a glossary. We had also then students focusing on what must be included and needed after viewing some models of A to Z books. What made an A to Z book better than another? And as we did that, we realized, okay, we need to have illustrations that are really engaging. And we realized if they're kindergartners, we have to keep it very, very simple. How can we use words that they may understand? And so from that, we created our rubric together. We showed them the rubric. Here's what we're expecting everybody to work on. And as you can see, the samples, words like unsustainable. Students also then came up with an idea, and we decided, why don't we do this triad section? It's a very small application of maybe something you can actually do based on what you've learned. And so you have these different pages where students are going through. And I actually, in order to actually share this, recently got it back from the kindergarten teachers briefly to just scan a few photos. And they were telling me, oh, we've been actually pulling students aside in small groups or one by a time, showing them and sharing with them so that they're getting exposed little by little versus, oh, it's on the shelf, take a look whenever you want. They're being very intentional about how they're also sharing this information with the students that are in the kindergarten.
But what does it do to those students in your class to put themselves up as like, I'm now an authority. Like, I've built this background knowledge. I've productively struggled through understanding these complex texts and these words. And now I'm an authority, and I'm going to teach others about it and teach a population that, like, really they have to think about, how can I simplify? There's some really deep thinking skills, but also just investment and engagement work going on there too.
Yeah, we made sure that our students also felt, I know you said before, safe, but I do think that's actually a very appropriate word because they feel like they can share honestly and they're not trying to produce something to please me. But we're really realizing, will this kindergartner understand? If not, let's discuss. And as we talk about the meaning of the words, then they'll create a rough draft. We'll take a look together and we'll say, yeah, that seems like a kindergartner might understand that better than what we had before. And then they'll create their final draft. Our student that made the glossary in particular, that was pretty difficult because he's actually decided, I want to do the glossary, and he's going to define all these words in a way that the kindergartners will understand as well. And so we had to really discuss, but because he had that investment, and ultimately not just him, but all my students, I shared with them the day that I was going to drop it off. I said, I'm dropping it off today to the kindergartners, and the excitement is very obvious. They couldn't wait to share it.
Yeah.
And so that was very obvious to me.
That's such a it's about that engagement. I think earlier in the chat someone said it, that's what matters to my students. Just some highlights from the chat in here. The integration, not the isolation of standards, is how we can truly bring the critical and creative thinking skills necessary for bridging between ELA and social studies. Being able to consider and analyze complexity is a key to the world we live in today. We have to prepare our students for the world. I just want to thank Paul for coming here. You're on your spring break this week, so thanks for giving us a little time. And Jane, thank you. And Jillian, as always, great to have you again on the webinar. Thank you all for coming here today, and I will be in touch. And I hope that you have a great Thursday night. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.